Welcome back. And today we need to discuss Richard Nixon and what a period generally known, particularly for American history, as the crisis of confidence resulting from the Vietnamese War, the oil crisis, and a stagnant economy across the 1970s. So from 1968 forward, actually from Nixon's presidency of 69 forward, America is really going to undergo some significant challenges. And for Nixon's part, he was determined not to end up like LBJ. He was not going to end up mired in a war that was unwinnable. And so what he wants to do is end the war, but end it in an honorable conclusion and an honorable way. Now, how do you do that? How do you stop the cycle of a limited war? How do you keep the escalations that have been happening from happening? We've gone from 100,000 to 500,000 troops on the ground in Vietnam with all the material support that consists of everything else. How do you get out of that without it looking like you've lost? So Nixon is going to institute what he calls a plan called Vietnamization, that he wants to expand U.S. involvement in one direction, but reduce it with troops on the ground. And the Vietnamization plan was to train the Vietnamese troops to protect themselves, to fight for themselves. And in the spring of 69, we had that 500,000 number. And by 71 and 72, you've got it to 60,000 troops on the ground. Now that's a significant reduction. Now the expansion part of it is through the air, through bombing, both covert and overt. So some of the bombing campaigns to weaken the war effort of the northern Vietnamese soldiers are going to be secret. Others are going to be quite out in your face. And so all of this is done to bring troops home, to quiet division, to quiet the divisions at home, the protests, the real tearing apart of the fabric of America over this incredibly controversial war, and to stop the protests, to stop the demonstrations, to stop all of the violence that was accompanying the Vietnamese War. Now, Nixon is going to go in front of the American people, and he's going to discuss some of the bombing campaigns that he is going to try to institute in northern Vietnam. Unfortunately, part of the campaign is, as the Vietnamese troops march down, they routinely leave Vietnamese territory into the jungles of Laos and Cambodia, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail and all the other resupply paths emerging down here in South Vietnam go through Laos and Cambodia. And so the CIA and covert bombings begin, codenamed Operation Menu, on March 1969. And over the next 14 months, you're going to have hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs dropped on Cambodia. And all of it was done in absolute secrecy. Right? Pains were done to keep all of this very, very secret. And by the time 1970 dawns, you've got U.S. and South Vietnamese forces in Cambodia, and Nixon going on television making sure to talk tough on communism, to talk tough on all of this, that the U.S. will not look like a pitiful and helpless giant amidst a third world nation. Now, this naturally will escalate the protests on college campuses, and you get instances of violence like you see at Kent State, where National Guardsmen are going to fire into protesters, killing a number of protesting students. And at this point, Congress is going to be afraid of Nixon's intentions and of his widening of the war, so they terminate the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. That yes, he's withdrawing troops, but he is expanding our military involvement into territories that may or may not be at war with the United States. And so that resolution that LBJ described as grandma's nightshirt is going to be canceled. And here you have a little bit of the geography of North and South Vietnamese territories. You see the pass and the resupply avenues that went through Laos, and then of course the North Vietnamese troops operating here in Cambodia. This is just a dot diagram based on bombs dropped on Cambodia. We don't have information, good information for Laos, but this just describes and shows you the scale of the bombing operations in Cambodia, which were enormous. Enormous and incredibly destructive. And the legacy of these bombs are still being felt today. The military operations there in Cambodia are still being felt today with undetonated ordnance that can still be found on a number of fields. Now, all of this leads to a significantly growing divide in America, and you can see it with some of the recent demonstrations in America today, that the demonstrations put a significant age gap divide and cultural gap in between America. Some are actually going to believe in Nixon, and some are going to actually believe in the Cambodian strategy, and it's very eerily similar of what's going on, recently with the demonstrations of this year. Some Americans are going to look at the demonstrators and see them as un-American, unpatriotic, and they're going to believe in Nixon. They're going to believe in Nixon and his strategy, and believe in it's a way for America to win the war, because America doesn't lose wars against third world powers. That's kind of the mindset of so many Americans, that we don't lose wars against Vietnam. Some believe that Nixon's strategy in Cambodia and in the bombings is a path towards victory. 1971 in June, a series of papers are going to be leaked, okay, by Daniel Ellsberg, leaked that show a pattern of behavior all the way back to 1964 about lies, about misinformation, about secrecy in the conduct of the war. And Ellsberg, much like some of the people in the modern day, is going to leak this information in an attempt to embarrass America, shame America, to get her out of this dishonorable, ignoble war and free America from the difficulties and the troubles that they are currently now in. So as all of this is ongoing, as all of these protests are ongoing, as all of this is reaching your nightly news on a regular basis, the Pentagon Papers are going to be published in the New York Times. This is going to lead to what we call, and what has been called, a credibility gap. And it's something that we take for granted today, but it wasn't always the case. We can thank LBJ and Nixon for this gap, this credibility gap, and the lack of trust, inherent trust that we have in our politicians. Because while all of this news is ongoing, while all of this scandal is ongoing, reporters embedded in the troops in Vietnam are going to reveal atrocities. They're going to reveal the scale of drug use in the military, as well as the racism that might exist between some of these integrated units. All of this doesn't paint a happy picture. And you're fighting the Vietnamese war with an unclear intent. And that's one of the things that every military strategist would tell you. For an effective war, you need clear wartime goals. And they do not have that at this point. Your goal is to win. Okay, well, how do I achieve victory? How do you achieve victory over an insurgent, invisible force in South Vietnam? The difficulties in fighting this war are manifest, and America is not terribly equipped to fight this war or to win this war, to envision it, really. So all of these problems are apparent. America as a nation seems to be tearing itself apart between the counterculture of the 1960s and the baby boomers of the World War II generation. And forgive me, not the baby boomers, but the parents of the baby boomers. All right. In the end, Nixon is going to achieve a ceasefire in 1973, mainly because he is seeking, and will detail his foreign policy issues, trying to get better détente relations with the Soviet Union and better relations with China. But the ceasefire negotiations have been ongoing for years, hoping to get a better a better understanding and a better relationship between the Cold War powers. In the end, as soon as the ceasefire comes, it is violated. The war continues for another 2 years, and by 1975, the Southern government is going to completely and utterly collapse, and Vietnam is united under a communist government, and you see Americans being evacuated on the helicopters out of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. And it seems that Vietnam was a cataclysmic failure. It becomes Saigon becomes Ho Chi Minh City, and you look at the overall cost, and you look at the what is frequently called the butcher's bill when it comes to a war, and you look at 58,000 American soldiers dying. The number of Vietnamese soldiers died is incalculable, along with the civilian total. How much have we spent on this war? Billions. And the costs of this war are still being tallied today, because you've got the veterans benefits that come with it. And it is one of the great scandals of our age is to see the Vietnamese veterans, their death toll, their homeless rates, their drug and alcohol addiction rates, that we have failed our veterans in such a cataclysmic way. In a number of ways, we're still paying the costs of all of that in terms of VA benefits. Now, the other side of it, say $200 billion in wartime spending, that means domestic and social reforms are impoverished. What do we get? Well, we get a retreat from the reforms that LBJ had promised and that Nixon has no interest in delivering on. You get inflation. And inflation at a rate that is kind of unthinkable for us today. You know, try to put it into perspective. An inflation rate that is double digits, meaning every year prices go up by 10 to 12 to 14%. Interest rates are going to be through the roof. I remember the commercials for people buying a car back in the early 1980s. It was when I was still a kid and paying attention to such things. You could get an affordable car loan, 4 years, 5 years, 14% interest, 17% interest. That type of inflationary economy is devastating. It's devastating on consumption, it's devastating on everything. And so inflation, the beginnings of it in the early 70s, because of all of this, is going to cripple the American economy as we go into 76, 77, 78. Okay. Now, the war is also going to keep our relationship strained with the Soviets and China, and really alienate a lot of our third world nations and allies, because the optics of the Vietnamese War were terrible. The atrocities, the bombings, the Agent Orange, the napalm, the covert bombings are going to do a great disservice to American credibility abroad. And of course, the domestic strain was even worse. What you saw was an extension of executive power in terms of the war-making powers of the president, and the ability to create more and more. The Tonkin Gulf resolution was seen as a radical extension of the executive powers. And over the course of this class, we've talked about Congress routinely ceding these powers. Now, because of this credibility gap, the need for more checks and balances are certainly going to be put into place. Okay. War Powers Act of 1973 is certainly going to check the ability of any president to deploy troops for longer than 60 days. And we're going to see this increase. We're going to see this ramp up as we're going forward. But the biggest impact of the Vietnam War on America is going to be psychological, what they call Vietnam Syndrome or Empire Shock. The physical legacy is bad enough, but the emotional legacy is further on. Now, the first Gulf War that America went into under George W. Bush, Herbert Walker Bush, okay? Everyone's going to warn of an unwinnable war, of Vietnam Syndrome. Is this another Vietnam? They said the same thing with Afghanistan. They said the same thing with the second Gulf War. You continue to say these things over and over and over again as the legacy, the memory of an American defeat in war continues to haunt us. So that legacy is significant. That legacy is very, very real and even present today. Okay. Now, when we talk about Nixon's policy, his strange bedfellow, if you will, of a German Jew, Henry Kissinger, and Richard Nixon, they come together with the Nixon Doctrine, and they're going to shift away from the traditional Cold War diplomacy of bipolarism and of the domino theory and containment. And Nixon is going to retreat from those views and say, I'll give you all the economic aid you want, particularly for Asia, but no more troops. I'm not going to put American lives in danger because that was too divisive at home, too catastrophic on the home front. What he wanted to do was train regional powers to maintain security in their areas, aka Vietnamization. We've continued that to a slight bit recently when we were talking about under President Obama, we were talking about Afghanistan and even the second Gulf War. We're trying to empower local powers to maintain their stability so we don't have to continue putting our soldiers at risk. So Nixon's foreign policy legacy is traditionally very, very strong. And it goes all the way back to the 50s when he was vice president. Only Nixon can go to the Soviet Union and duke it out with Khrushchev. Well, Nixon is also going to wind up going to the Soviet Union and shaking hands with Leonid Brezhnev and shaking hands with Chairman Mao, giving rise to the statement, only Nixon can go to China, kind of an idea. And then as tensions and ceasefire negotiations are ongoing in Vietnam, you see a push by Nixon to relax the diplomatic tension abroad. Concessions. We don't want to talk tough with containment. You don't want to talk tough with domino theory. What you want to do is give a little, get a little. And Nixon, of course, is the first one to realize that Mao and the Soviet Union dislike each other intensely. And so he's going to look to exploit that rivalry between China and the Soviet Union. In the end, in 1972, he winds up with very important landmark agreements with the Soviet Union. Those treaties become known as SALT I and ABM Treaty. Well, the SALT I is Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. This is the first of many that will come out. And they're looking to eliminate classes of weapons placed in certain areas. De-escalation. Okay. You don't like these medium-range missiles in Europe. Okay, we'll move those if you move stuff away from the American sphere. Negotiations. And the ABM Treaty, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. We're looking to end long-range missiles that have the ability to be first strike capabilities. That's kind of what we're looking at. First strike capabilities. Also in 1972, it was a really busy year for him. He goes to China. He shakes Mao's hand. That's kind of been parodied and been sung about in a number of different songs. The only thing they can agree on is that neither of them likes the Soviet Union. But Nixon goes with his wife, and they stand on the Great Wall of China. They talk about a few things. They agree on nothing except the danger of the Soviet Union. And so for relations between the Soviet Union and America, and relations between China and America, these are landmark agreements, landmark decisions. And in particular, the breaking of the ice with China will eventually lead to the recognition of Mao's government in 1979, and the opening of diplomatic relations will certainly pervade everything else. The other complication for Nixon in 72 into 73 is going to be something called the Yom Kippur War. And Yom Kippur War is a month-long war in 1973 where Egypt, Syria, and Jordan look to increase their holdings and look to attack Israel during the holy holiday of Yom Kippur. Now, it was a surprise attack, and both Syria and Egypt, looking to reverse some of the losses in previous wars with Israel in the 7 Days War, see initial successes, but eventually superior Israeli tactical advantage, largely due to American supply, American money, American military supply, is going to push both the Egyptians and the Syrians out of the territories that they had encroached into. And it's again another humiliation, a humiliation of the Islamic world at the hands of the Israelis. And they do it with the benefit of American support. So, in retaliation for American support and resupply of Israel, the oil producing and exporting countries, OPEC, this pool of petroleum producing countries, is going to issue an embargo. Now, this embargo, this energy crisis, is going to do significant damage to America and its allies. It's going to cause the price of oil to skyrocket per barrel. Now, America has enough strategic reserves to cover itself, but the Western world and all the NATO allies are going to be significantly impacted by this embargo. Okay. So there's Nixon, the Great Wall. And you can see a few of the American faces in and around Richard Nixon and his wife. But the defining characteristic of Nixon's presidency comes with the Watergate scandal. And we've all heard about it here and there, and here's the Watergate Hotel in and around. And Nixon, amidst his foreign policy successes and the negotiations for a ceasefire in Vietnam, is running for re-election against Governor George McGovern. And this was really a foregone conclusion. Nixon is going to win re-election, as the Democratic candidate McGovern really doesn't have a realistic chance of unseating an incumbent president at a time of war. And so he's going to cruise to a 60% electoral college victory. Very, very easy. But the Watergate scandal revolves around the June 17th arrest of 5 men who were arrested for breaking in the Democratic National Committee's office at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. Now, these men were associated with something called CREEP. It's always kind of a nice acronym. The Committee to Re-elect the President, CREEP. Now, very little is done about this arrest. Very little is known. It's kind of a blurb on the papers and on the news brought as we run to the election. But after the election, as we come into, the FBI is going to get wind of this, and of course, it turns very political. And Nixon has always had this conception of enemies out there in the world that are looking to undermine him, that are looking to get him. And it's one of the things that most people didn't know about Richard Nixon, that he was incredibly paranoid, that he routinely kept lists of enemies. He employed what he called plumbers that would go and solve problems. Dirty tricks, blackmail. Nixon was true to that axiom, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now, what Nixon was going to do on a number of occasions with his plumbers and his dirty tricks was to use the authority of the federal government to, in his own words, screw his political enemies. Or any way we could screw them. And he talks about, that. And he used that real phrase in relation to Dick Cavett, who was basically an entertainment. He was a host of a talk show, of a variety show, and a comedian and a satirist. And Nixon is recorded, because that's the other thing about his paranoia. He routinely records every conversation that happens in the Oval Office. That's going to come back to bite him. But in terms of Watergate, Nixon was never involved. He didn't know about it. He was not a driving force into the breaking in of this committee. It was an independent action of this committee to seek out and find what the Democratic National Committee's plans are going to be in terms of trying to undermine and combat Nixon. Was it necessary? Absolutely not. It's completely a non-factor, because you're going to win this election running away. And that's not what got Nixon in trouble. But when it comes to the FBI's attention and they start investigating it, Nixon instructs the CIA to compel the FBI to back off, citing the nebulous sort of concern of national security. Two reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, at the Washington Post, keep digging. They don't let it go. This idea of, what did people know? When did they know it? Who's investigating? Why is it ongoing? Did the president know about this? Why did the investigation stop? They keep digging. And they had an informant, codenamed Deep Throat. Later we find out, near his death, we'd always suspected that it might have been somebody at the FBI, and it was Mark Felt, who was the deputy director of the FBI, that kept feeding Woodward and Bernstein information about Nixon's obstruction of justice for not allowing a federal investigation to go forward. That's what he's guilty of. That's what he's going to be charged with. And then this quickly starts to achieve a life of its own. And the story of Nixon ending the investigation breaks. Senate hearings convene on television in May to August. Testimony reveals that, yes, Nixon records everything in the Oval Office. And so Congress subpoenas the tapes. He refuses, citing executive privilege. So we're in a standoff. Does the president have executive privilege over a subpoena from Congress? Is he compelled to give over these conversations? Is he compelled to do all of this? We still don't know. That's still an issue that we talk about even today. But nevertheless, the impact of these is going to be felt. Now, in a completely separate endeavor, his vice president, Spiro Agnew, is going to resign in a scandal related to his time as the governor of Maryland. This gives rise to the one time that the House Minority Leader, Republican Gerald Ford, is going to assume the vice presidency. And Gerald Ford is a moderate. He was a member from Michigan. He played football at Michigan. He was a football hero back in the day. So it doesn't get a whole lot of conspiracy theory at this point, because nobody really believes that, the Senate hearings and the testimony are going to lead towards impeachment. But sure enough, October 24th, impeachment proceedings begin. Okay. Nixon finally starts releasing tapes from the White House with mysteriously blank or edited sections. I don't know what happened. The conversation cuts out. Oh, I have nothing to do with it. The tapes that he releases reveal nothing criminal, but what it does reveal is a pattern of racist slurs, both anti-Jew, anti-black, anti-everyone, and a constant stream of paranoia and profanity that is rather eye-opening to a lot of the American people. And by July of 1974, Supreme Court rules Nixon must release all the tapes, and all the tapes are forthcoming. When they do appear, two key sections are missing, and so the House Judiciary Committee finds grounds for impeachment. Abuse of power, contempt of Congress, and of course the big one, obstruction of justice. Now, this is kind of a foregone conclusion. A year and a half long, as Gerald Ford will describe it, national nightmare is going to end with the resignation of Richard Nixon. And there he is, giving his customary two fingers for, we hope it's peace, at this point, as he boards, the helicopter and leaving the White House. Who becomes president? Well, his selected successor, Gerald Ford. And this is where a lot of the conspiracy theories come out, because of what Gerald Ford is going to do in the first days of his presidency. But the impact of all of this is going to be enormous. Cambodia, Watergate, all of this stuff is running simultaneously. LBJ and Nixon's lies really start to widen the credibility gap between what the government says and what the people believe. And then eventually Congress across the 74, 75, 76 is going to institute more and more bills to limit presidential power. But as I said, Gerald Ford is that first non-elected president or vice president. He wasn't on a presidential ticket to become president. And he goes on the television and he says he wants to end this, as we said, long national nightmare. But what you've got is a divided nation, a really shaken nation by the energy crisis, Vietnam syndrome, and inflation. And what does he do? He pardons Nixon as his first official act as president. His approval rating was good coming into the presidency, and it drops in half overnight. For the rest of the term, Ford is able to accomplish almost nothing. He's best known for tripping and falling and slipping on stairs coming in and out of Air Force One. Gives rise to this idea and gives almost a career to Chevy Chase on Saturday Night Live because he rose to fame with his very amusing interpretations of Gerald Ford tripping, falling, pouring water on himself, tripping over his desk, all kinds of other gaffes that are going to make Chevy Chase a household name. Now, here we got Gerald Ford sitting in Nixon's Oval Office, and he really changes nothing about the office. He's not there long enough to do anything decor-wise or anything else. He's just kind of thrust into this. And a year and a half later, he's going to run for election. And here's the image of Ford sitting in the decor for Nixon's White House. And I always love that there's ashtrays. You know you're stepping back in time when there are ashtrays in public offices and indoors. But the election of 1976 puts a one-term governor of Georgia, a deeply religious peanut farmer with populist appeal, running against Gerald Ford. And as you can tell, you're going to get the majority of the South because Carter is a Southerner, and you're going to get New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio because he is a Democrat. And so the election is going to bring a non-politician, an outsider. And Carter is probably one of the most misunderstood presidents of our time. And, you know, I talk about Carter, and he's done enormous work since he left the presidency that has earned him a Nobel Peace Prize. But even as president, he's going to be honest with the American people. He's faced with a stagnant economy and inflation, and he gets coined the term stagflation. The energy crisis is crippling the United States, and Carter is going to go onto television, you know, in jeans and a sweater, and look very grandfatherly. And he's going to talk about limits and sacrifices and conservation to help end this American malaise, energy crisis, stagnant economy. And I don't know how familiar you are with any of the cars that are out there in the 1960s, but not a single one of them were designed to be energy efficient. Nothing in America is designed with energy efficiency in mind. And so Carter is going to sit from the Oval Office and the White House and give these speeches and he is absolutely going to tell the truth to the American people. You want your Cadillac that gets, 8 miles to a gallon with a 440 or the Cadillacs had the 454s. You want something like that? It's not affordable anymore. Today we could look at it. About 5 years ago, gas was at $3 to $4 a gallon. People were talking about limits and sacrifices and hybrid cars. Well, now it's back to $1.50 because of fracking, because of so many other technological innovations that we've retreated from some of that. But Carter in 1976 and 77 in his first addresses is going to go onto the television and tell Americans exactly what they need to hear. And my God, are we going to hate him for it? Unemployment is in double digits, inflation at double digits, and Europe and Japan are now competing with the United States because we've done our job. We've rebuilt them. We've made their economies competitive. European cars, Japanese cars are going to be imported into America as we continue to build these massive automobiles that are not energy efficient. Japan is building smaller. Europe is building smaller, responsive to it all. By 1971, you see the first time that we'll have trade deficit. We import more than we export. Okay, and of course Nixon is going to wind up taking the U.S. off of the gold standard. Certain other nations are going to leave that gold standard as well, meaning there's nothing backing up the currency that you have in circulation with hard currency. And so certain other nations are going to do the same thing, but it is significantly going to weaken the dollar in a world trade endeavor. OPEC here appears to swallow up and destroy this American lifestyle that shows you these Cadillacs or Continentals or Lincolns, that are enormous. And the average for cars is 13 miles per gallon when gas was 38 cents a gallon. And it's going to take a very long time for American industry to shift to that. Focus on energy efficiency, if we've ever have. You still look around in Texas, and what do you see? Enormous trucks everywhere, that get 17, 18 miles per gallon. If you go to Europe, the taxes on something like that are enormous. Most of the cars are very, very small, and the engines are small, efficient, 40 to 50 miles per gallon. So America is going to be slow to respond to all of this, and whatever issues the federal government tries to do seem to make matters worse. Okay? You're dealing with the specter of the price of oil skyrocketing here in the 70s, particularly at the height of the embargo, skyrocketing lines for people waiting to get gas because gasoline has become a very scarce commodity. Okay? And so our problems are going to continue to go forward. But Carter, much like Nixon, is going to have significant significant foreign policy successes. Now, for Carter, his success is in the Middle East. He brings Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, Egypt and Israel together for the first time. A peace treaty between any Arab nation and Israel is negotiated. Now, it doesn't do a whole lot, but the simple act of Anwar Sadat and Israel and Menachem Begin sitting at a table, Egypt and Israel sitting at a table, is a recognition of Israel's existence and its right to exist, which of course is going to be denounced by Syria and so many other Arab nations. However limited it was a start to face-to-face negotiations that were critical going forward. Now, the foreign policy weaknesses of Carter really show in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, that the policy of détente, this cooling of relations that Nixon instituted, had been deteriorating for months and for years. The Soviets roll tanks into Afghanistan. The CIA is going to start to support the resistance, the Mujahideen. We are arming Afghani soldiers to fight against the Soviets. In particular, one of those key soldiers there, a young Osama bin Laden. We're going to boycott grain and equipment to the Soviets. The 1980 Summer Olympics were held in Moscow that year. America boycotted. 1984, the Summer Olympics were held in Los Angeles. The Soviet bloc boycotted. Sports become political. Kind of hard to imagine, the 60s, 70s, and 80s where athletics, track and field, becomes a vehicle through which you can fight the Cold War. And part of this Carter Doctrine is going to be the use of force, unilateral force, back to almost a Truman Doctrine, domino theory, bipolarity view, a regression from Nixon's doctrine. And it's going to cause significant disruption for us. This is the period, along with the 1950s, when the relations between America and the Middle East start to deteriorate. And in particular, it's over Truman and subsequent presidents' support, unilateral support for Israel, no matter what. That's going to do significant credibility damage to America in the Middle East. Now, Iran is going to be the other hotspot where trouble pops up, and it sees something new in the rise of political Islam. Before, the imams and the ayatollahs had no real political role, only religious. But Ayatollah Khomeini is going to lead a religiously oriented nationalist state, pushing out the American-backed Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He was sent into exile in 1979. Now, we'd seen the Shah exiled before in the 1950s, 1953 in particular, by a nationalist government under Mohammad Mossadegh. And then in 1954, a CIA, British SAS-led counterinsurgency placed the Shah back into power. Those fears are going to be revived 25 years later because he's in the U.S. Pahlavi is seeking medical treatment. He's dying. He's dying of cancer. But America doesn't know, or sorry, the Iranian people don't know that. They think he's in America queuing up again for a CIA, SAS sort of insurgency again, where they're going to place the Shah of Iran back on the back into governmental power. So mobs thinking that the CIA is operating out of the American embassy in Tehran, they storm it, taking 53 Americans hostage. They suspected the embassy was being used by the CIA, and they go through it, and what do they find? Yes, the CIA is operating out of the American embassy. So these hostages are held for 444 days. Carter freezes Iranian assets in the U.S., breaks diplomatic relations, even sends a rescue effort in early April of 1980, hoping to invigorate his electoral campaign. That would have been a major success to rescue these hostages. And yellow ribbons are tied around pretty much every tree that you could find. I think it was Glenn Campbell with the tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree. This idea of the hostage crisis is going to consume the American imagination at this point. The rescue effort was, in a sense, a special forces team that's going to storm the embassy, rescue the hostages, jump on the helicopters, and get back to Iraqi territory. Unfortunately, the helicopters crash in a refueling stop before they even get to Tehran. So it is just a dismal failure and an embarrassment to America on the world stage. The resolution of this crisis comes Inauguration Day, 1981, mainly because a new president is taking office. The Iranians just simply wanted to embarrass Jimmy Carter for as much as they could. And also, there was a certain amount of fear about what a Republican president would do. What the election in November 1980 goes the way of Ronald Reagan. And there was significant fear about what would happen. What would Reagan do? A lot of people were afraid he might just start dropping bombs on Iran and ask questions later. And hence the Iranians are going to release the hostages. Now also during this time, during this 1980 time period, we're looking at a foil to the radical Islamic state there in Iran. And so we see a very secular ruler in Iraq. And we start supporting him. His name was Saddam Hussein. So we start funding Saddam Hussein as a counterpose to the Islamic State of Iran. And of course, they emerge into war in September of 1980. The U.S. is officially going to say that they are neutral, but very quickly start supplying arms and money and technology to Saddam Hussein. So out of the last 20 years of some of our efforts to stamp out worldwide terrorism, we've come into contact with the Mujahideen and the remnants of that in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, and of course we've been to war twice in Iraq to remove Saddam Hussein. So the failed policies of the 1970s and the Cold War doctrines had come home to roost for the 2000s. Okay? And of course, the Mujahideen are going to be abandoned by the CIA and by America when the troubles there in Afghanistan come to an end. And they're not going to forget that. They're not going to see that. But in Iran, you see Carter portrayed as weak, and of course the Shah wanted for murder. Iranians certainly are going to be embarrassed. Now, as 1980 dawns and Ronald Reagan becomes your president, the U.S. economy is weak, uncontrollable. We are vulnerable on the world stage in terms of Vietnam and Iran. Communism is expanding in Afghanistan. And your president, however sensible he is, however realistic he is, he's talking about limits and sacrifices. And that's not what Americans want to hear. What do we want to hear? We want to hear great American values. We want to see renew America's strength. We don't want to see Carter Mondale like we did in '76. We want to see Reagan and Bush. Because Reagan is going to tell the American people exactly what they want to hear, not necessarily what they need to hear. Reagan's going to, in an incredibly stylistic way, going to tell you about America winning the Cold War. Going to tell you about how America is going to defeat all of these forces, and how we're going to get the economy back together, and how we're going to make America, and that phrase, great. He didn't think Donald Trump, thought of that on his own. This was a Reagan sort of slogan, talking about greatness, talking about American greatness, how we're going to bring it all back from the crisis of the 1970s, this crisis of confidence. And it's going to work. But we'll cover Ronald Reagan in our next lecture.